And we are live. Hi, Kweli. How are you?
Good. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Good, very good. Super happy to be here this morning talking with you. We're not so far away geographically. I often have calls that are like overseas in Europe, in France, etc. But we're let's say we're pretty close compared to that.
A little closer to home.
So you're hailing from
Washington D.C. area. Call it the DMV, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. But I'm in Northern Virginia,
okay,
close to the
Northern
city.
Virginia. Very
Born
cool.
and raised. Yep.
All right. Well, yeah, I'm gonna share a little bit about that in a minute. But thanks for being here in this on this Friday morning on the Papa PhD podcast. Just to kind of present what's happening to people who are watching this for the first time. So the Papa PhD podcast is about graduate student life, graduate student career readiness, graduate student difficulties, anything around the PhD, masters. And today I'm super happy to have Kweli here to talk about his recent experience finishing his PhD, but also to talk about other things that have to do with his heritage, his family heritage, which is really interesting too, but which relates in a very close way, to his studies. So it's kind of a behind the scenes of the recording of the podcast episode. So we'll be here today talking for 45-ish minutes, and then eventually I'll take the audio from our conversation, edit it, clean it up, and make a podcast episode that I'll publish on the podcast feed a few weeks from now. So just for anyone who's just gotten to either LinkedIn or YouTube and following on this conversation. So it's a kind of behind the scenes of the podcast recording. So what I'll do, Kweli, is I'll take a little pause. I'll officially start the podcast recording, give everyone a short summary of your bio, and then we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
Welcome to this new episode of Papa PhD. Today I have the great pleasure of having with me Kweli Zukeri. Kweli Zukeri was born and raised in Falls Church, Virginia. He has a BA in journalism and mass communication and a minor in social entrepreneurship from UNC at Chapel Hill, as well as a master's in psychology, 2018, and a PhD in developmental psychology from Howard University. Both his master's thesis and dissertation focused on exploring the impact of African-centered school-based programming on American African student racial and cultural identity, as well as American African student learning. Prior to his recent graduate studies, he also studied ancient African Kemetic language for 2 years in Howard's Department of Africana Studies and has been a facilitator for the Egypt on the Potomac field trip of Washington, D.C. for the last decade. Welcome to Papa PhD, Kweli.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I'm super happy to have you here. Kweli and I have a relationship. Kweli's partner is my cousin, and so it's a very special episode for me. For many reasons. To kind of close this distance, we don't live so far from each other, but we haven't had so many chances to meet. But when I saw announcement and publications around Kweli's graduation, and I saw his interests, and then we discussed a little bit more about his heritage and his family story. I said, okay, I need to invite Kweli on Papa PhD. We need to talk about what he has to share.
Sure. And I'm excited to be here because it's still almost too soon, right? It's only last year that I finished, and I'm still a little traumatized. Anyone who's going through that process knows it's traumatic. But it does help also, I think, to process and get past the trauma to just talk it out here. So it's nice to get the opportunity to just kind of break down how that went.
I agree completely. There's a therapeutic aspect to it, let's say. But I've seen this, and a lot of the conversations I have on the podcast or with people who come to me through the podcast has to do with changing careers, transition moments in your young adult and in your young professional life. And I do think that looking back, taking a moment, let's say these 45 minutes, but to look back and not rehash, but take another look at what happened without the emotion that you're going through when it's happening, often helps people have a more positive look on things that happened. Plus, kind of be able to write their professional story, because this is the context usually I have conversations about. But take all of that, which while you live through it, and anyone who's gone through a PhD has had moments of suffering and hardship, but be able to look with that emotional distance and say, okay, there was constructive stuff. I learned a lot, and this is part of me professionally, and I can use it. Even the hardships are part of who I am now professionally, and has brought me strength that I wouldn't have if I hadn't gone through it. Anyway, maybe I'm waxing poetic a little bit, but I think you you understand a little bit what I'm saying.
No, 100%. I mean, there's a resilience that you have to have and develop to get through a program. All the rigmarole. I mean, I think the last 2 years, it took me 7 years total. I mean, I got my master's along the way. It was a joint program, and that helped at least to get something. And I figured I elected to do so because, I wanted something in my hands in case, God forbid, something happens and I don't actually finish. But I think after 5 years, and I mean, throughout that, having a full-time job and a family and other activities, some of which I had to put down and just admit I can't do everything at once. After those last 2 years, what really sustained me, I think, more than anything, was like, I need to be done. I need to finish this. It needs to be off my shoulders. I started because I was very excited about what I was doing, but you start to get burnt and just want to be done. But that helped push me, I think, at the very end. I mean, it's kind of like pledging a fraternity. Like, if by the end, I don't know if anyone's listening that's done that, they know, like, by the end, you just want to be done and live your life again. So it's kind of like that.
I agree, and there's this thing about there's this thing people say, a good thesis is a finished thesis, and it's true that it gets harder. It's like if you're you're walking into a swamp, and each step takes more and more energy in that last stretch. But then if you know that you have this goal, it's all worth it in the end. I think, and it's worth pushing that little bit and tiring yourself a little bit. And you talked about being traumatized. There's some trauma to it for sure. It's like anyway. It makes me think of a birth. You've gone through this really difficult thing, and then you're on the other side, and you get your diploma. And you kind of have to make sense of all of it. So no, I know it's emotionally it's a particular and an interesting experience. But I also don't want to not acknowledge that it may even be more than just an ordeal to some people, and it may affect them in terms of mental health. And for people who are, I always say, take care of your mind first. And then, even if you need to take a pause on your thesis writing, etc., and then resume. But anyway, that's my spiel about mental health. It always comes first.
No, for sure.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, well, that did happen to me, I think, in year 4, after the majority of my classwork was done. And again, I was working a full-time job. I mean, I worked at Howard University. I still do. So I was fortunate to be able to also take classes that have made it much more convenient, of course. But after about 4 years of coursework, I really did have to take a step back and realize there's a huge opportunity cost to doing this, because I don't actually have time to do everything I was doing. I didn't actually have time, right? So, without getting into all the details, relationships suffered, other things got neglected. So I did have to take some time to step back and say, let me just figure some things out before I continue, because obviously that family and other things come first. And yeah, the stress level. So that's number one, like you said. I think having a healthy regimen of meditation and just
Hmm.
consciousness about how you're feeling and what you're doing day to day without instead of just getting caught up in the routine and the rigmarole of making sure you're on top of everything. It's just as important. Easier said than done, but it is definitely possible.
Yeah.
And I think to a large part you want to rely on your networks. I mean, I couldn't have finished without family around me, my partner, my mother, who helped take care of the kids very many times along the way. Other
Hmm.
people, my cohorts in the program, who if I have a question or if I'm not trying, my professors might not be available, but they are there for me late night or whatever. Like you really realize how much you have to rely on other people. And
Yeah.
that's a lesson of life. You really nobody makes it on their own, period. I mean, America has this myth of rugged individualism. That's a complete myth. Nobody is successful on their own. So I
Sorry.
think this process helps illuminate that.
Sorry, there was a little glitch there, but yeah, I agree. I created I produced a video on the Papa PhD YouTube channel, which is it takes a village, or I don't remember the exact title, but it takes a village to do your PhD. You're not gonna go it, you're not gonna go it alone. Although it's your work at the end, I totally agree with you that the whole community that's around you, be it directly your peers, your professor, but also your family, your friends, your whatever other groups you're part of, are really, really, really important to make this experience, which is a hard one, doable, and to help you get to the end of it.
For sure.
Now I'm just gonna. I see someone has given a like online, and I'm gonna just take this chance to ask, if you're watching now, can you just tell us if the levels, my audio and Kweli's audio, are kind of balanced, or if one of us is louder, just so I can adjust if needed. And thank you to anyone who's watching. And yeah, I hit the space bar here on my keyboard, and it brought up the thumbnail on us, but it's okay. It's not going to come up on the podcast.
Sure.
But it's super interesting. One of the things that I really wanted to talk to about, that I didn't want to miss, because again, the audience of Papa PhD is people who are thinking of getting a PhD, or in the middle of their PhD, who are in the transition after the PhD. And you mentioned a couple of times in passing that you were working during your PhD, and you had a family, a young family. But I'd really like you to, if possible, talk a little bit about how that was made possible for you, and how, because I know that this job, the fact that you worked, had a positive impact, let's say, in the financial aspect of going through grad school, but also it took time. There was time that you had to invest, or to give to that job. So I'd really be curious, if possible, to have your input on how, what sorts of jobs you can take. What can work to do a PhD and be working also at the same time, because I don't think it's something that I've seen a lot, and I think a lot of people might probably be curious of what is out there, even in universities, because if I'm right, this work that you mentioned was at university,
Right.
right?
So
So
yeah,
how does that work? Yeah.
sure. So I've worked at Howard University the last 12 years. I started as a student employee. I was just a brief period of time as a visiting student as an undergrad, but
Okay.
actually didn't actually go to school undergrad at Howard. But was a student employee, then a wage employee, salary, became manager. Now I'm director of user experience and web strategy. So I've, spent some time there, just in the professional sense. But really, yeah, like the huge benefit of working at the university for me has been that I'm able to get a free education, right? So the first couple of years, I actually took post-bac studies for
Okay.
Africana studies, right? That's why I studied ancient African language, really to understand ancient African civilization as a means of understanding that culture in East Africa and ancient Egypt. And I thought I was going to get into Africana studies further, but decided instead to get into psychology. And I mean, that was a 7-year process. And I think it's been, when you work at a university, that is a benefit. not all universities have the same level of benefit, but at Howard University, we can take up to 8 credits or 2 courses per semester, which is really good, relatively speaking. So I took summer school as well, just to kind of expedite that process. I've always had managers or people that I report to that are very supportive, right? Because we're at a university, and I think understanding the importance of people pursuing higher education is really important in that atmosphere. But I think at the same time, I've always been given the space and flexibility to do those things because, I get my job done, right? So there's definitely been times where if I have to go to class during the day, I might have to go home and finish some work stuff, right? And that's just a sacrifice. I mean, I think as simple as you can do as much as you can to maintain mental and emotional health, and it's a sacrifice, right? Every time is a sacrifice. Time is finite, even though time doesn't really exist. It's all a psychological construct, right? But it does actually exist day to day. It does mean something. So
yeah, we need to deal with it. We need to, yeah.
So I think just being in that atmosphere has been very beneficial and helped in terms of supporting it, working at a university. So of course, there's only so many university jobs that exist, but I mean, that is definitely an avenue I think most people don't think about.
That's it. I hadn't heard about it before reading your journey.
Yeah. Tuition remission. So, and I think when I was in the program, I definitely had conversations with a lot of my cohorts and people, classmates, and them just talking about how much debt they were accruing by going to school, right? Taking out loans. And, I believe education should be free for all of us. It would benefit the whole, instead of spending money on military and war, just put half of that in education and everyone would get a free education. But I felt that actually helped motivate me too, just knowing that, hey, I'm so fortunate right now to be in a program where I get it paid for. I don't have to worry about paying this debt off next. I even have professors who told me about the debt they're still paying off, and they've been teaching for like 10 years.
Oh,
right.
Wow.
So like, that helped motivate me. Like I can't complain basically. Right. This is paid for. So I think that was a huge benefit just in and of itself.
And so just out of, again, for people who are listening and thinking about what conversations lead to a position like this. So you said you started working there when you weren't even a student of the university, but who do you reach out to ask, hey, are there positions for me as a student here? Who, what office, what person is the key stakeholder, the key person you need to talk to, or office you need to talk with to see if opportunities like this exist in your university?
Well, I mean, it's basically though, like if you're coming into it as trying to get hired as someone like staff, you would just see what benefits the university offers as a staff member. So like your job might have nothing to do with obviously what you want to study, or it could, of course, right? A lot of people I've seen come in and get an MBA because that really relates to almost anything you could be doing. But you just want to see what is their actual tuition remission benefit. And then, of course, you have to get a job. You have to be accepted into a position. At least in my institution, you had to be a salary employee for at least a year before actually then pursuing or applying for a program and pursuing that program. The other thing is, for parents out there who might have children who are close to the age that they want to start undergrad, at least at Howard University, for your children, if you're in, they can go to school for free as well, just for undergraduate. So obviously that's a huge benefit for your children.
It's a huge plus, yeah.
So that's something to consider as well.
Okay, so basically look at the job postings, but are there postings specifically for student positions? Because you said your first position was as a student. I don't remember the exact term,
Right.
but are there postings specifically geared towards students?
No, not in that sense. I mean, I happened to come to Howard after I finished UNC at Chapel Hill in 2008. I had studied abroad and done some things. So I had like 2 classes left, just random credits I had to get. And I'm from the area, so I decided it was an opportunity to experience an HBCU because I went to UNC at Chapel Hill, which is what we call a PWI, predominantly white institution. And I wanted to experience an HBCU. Being in North Carolina, there's lots of HBCUs that I'd visited and had fraternity brothers in and stuff like that. And didn't actually get to go to one. So I said, let me take this time and just go to Howard University. And my godmother happened to also work at Howard. So was able to actually work for a center on campus that she actually had started and founded.
Okay.
So I was just a student employee, but that's because I was actually undergrad still. So that had nothing to do with what happened later necessarily.
Okay. I see. So you just mentioned HBCUs. and you didn't expand the the acronym, but it's historically Black colleges and universities,
Correct.
if I remember well. Yeah. So, and this is kind of the subject that we were going to talk about, because you've experienced the PWI like model, and then like you said, you really wanted to experience the HBCU. HBCU model, and that was the first taste of it that you had, and I really, because you've tasted both, I'd really love for you to well, and also because I know that you've had a very fulfilling, at least that's how I interpreted it, journey through the HBCU experience. I really want maybe your point of view on why HBCUs are important, what role they play for young American African burgeoning scientists or researchers or scholars. I really would like your input on that, especially given that you've been on both sides of the fence, let's say.
Sure. And I appreciate you saying American African. I know that was in my bio. I'm not sure if that used that term yourself, but to me, that's just you flip that identity, because it's placing emphasis on being African and being a type of African, being of the African diaspora, right? Instead of being Cape Verde African or whatever, American African, it just describes where you grew up, but kind of from the Pan-African perspective of, but we all still connect as people of African descent. So to me, that's when you flip that term, what it means. But yeah, HBCUs. I guess I can start with, hearing from some of my other cohorts in my program as well. So I've had at least several people that I had heard in my program say that they were at a PWI doing a graduate program and decided to leave and come to Howard because they did not get the support for the research they wanted to do, or nobody was there that could really even support them, right? So they wanted to research things related to the Black community or the Black life and experience in this country or abroad, and there just wasn't that support at the institution they were at. So they went to a place that they knew would support such a thing and had the expertise to support such a thing, right? And that to me was very illuminating of the type of graduate students you see at Howard. I mean, there's something that the scholar Manning Marable calls the Black intellectual tradition, right? And it's speaking to a long intellectual lineage of being scholar activists, right? Not just producing knowledge for knowledge's sake, but for what? What are we doing with this knowledge? How are we applying it to improve things around us, to improve our own community, to improve our own life and experience, especially in the context of American Africans, where obviously there's a large oppression historically and in the present, right? So Howard students, I noticed, were always very much mission driven. There's psychology, and then there's something we call Black psychology. And to distinguish the two, is Black psychology is a similar vein. Like, what are we actually doing with the psychology? In our courses, we might talk about Piaget and other people that were instrumental in the field of psychology, but then immediately after getting through all of that, it's like, well, what research is there about what concerns us specifically, and how are we using that? How are we going to use that, right? So it's being a scholar activist, I think, is really important, is part of that story. For me, well, first of all, I guess, I don't know, I think a lot of your audience is international and probably doesn't know the context of why HBCUs are important. So HBCUs began, first, I think to me, you got to start with the history of education of people of African descent in this country, right? Before antebellum, while there was still legalized slavery in this country, people of African descent could be brutalized just for learning how to read or write. Right. It was a very dangerous practice to even learn that. So that's the context you begin with, because people who want to purport that other people don't have a soul or are not fully human, of course, you want to keep them ignorant so that they can't rebel against that. But there was always resistance. There was never a moment of non-resistance in this context from people of African descent. And one of the ways that they resisted is by learning how to read and write and then applying those skills, right? Both free people and people who were still enslaved. And there were white allies who definitely helped that process and put their own lives at risk as well, but not to the same degree of obviously the Black people doing it. So this is the context you start with. But even in this context, free Africans in this country started schools in the South and in the North to teach, like, you take initiative, take it into your own hands. If y'all are not going to help us, we're going to do for ourselves, period. And this was always the context prior to slavery even ending. Now you have,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Civil War, institutionalized slavery ends. Immediately after, the first thing black folk do is start opening up schools and teaching each
Mm-hmm.
other informally and formally with no money. Didn't matter if you had money or not, right? This ended up in the late 19th century compelling the country. Black people in the South were the ones who compelled the country to have a common school or a public school education system. This was the actual initiative, but unfortunately, that kind of over that kind of subverted independent black education, and federal money started going to all these places. And instead, you know, in the early 20th century, it was clear, it wasn't a secret that public education was not meant to educate; it was meant to socialize, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just non-Anglo-Saxon, not just non-white people, sort of quote unquote, which is always being redefined. But as more Europeans were coming from Europe into the country, they wanted to make Anglo-Saxons wanted to make sure that they're socialized to have our values
Mm-hmm.
and become white people, right? So this is all arbitrary, obviously. So in this context, but going back to right after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau supports HBCUs being open because the other schools weren't taking black students, right? So Howard University is founded in 1867 with a bunch of other HBCUs, and specifically with the intent of teaching people of African descent. I mean, there's a lot more to that story, but this is just a brief overview. And
Mm-hmm.
at this point, we have around 100 HBCUs throughout the country.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a few HBCUs actually prior to the end of the Civil War that were founded, like Wilberforce and in Ohio and Philadelphia. But obviously, it's very important. I mean, even today, although I think HBCUs only represent 3% of the schools in this country, we graduate almost 20%. 20% of almost 20% of black graduates are from HBCU. So there's clearly
Okay.
still a huge need being fulfilled, right? And you have some people in popular media who downplay the need for HBCUs or question it. Do we still need this, right? We don't have legal segregation. Um, but I
Mm-hmm.
saw this question posed in about 10 years ago to a former Howard president, and he said, I I don't even accept the premise of your question. I would actually counter your question with, what can other schools learn from the resilience of the people that have made these HBCUs continue to live all these
Mm-hmm.
years, about the culture on HBCU's campus, right? This is something that's very important to this country. So in my own family, my grandparents were both went to HBCUs. They both actually got their undergrad degree at Shaw University, which is one of the oldest ones in North Carolina, and then proceeded to work at various HBCUs throughout their career. My grandmother was an administrator, a dean of students at several schools at Fisk, Tuskegee Institute, as well as she worked at Shaw, I believe, as well. And my grandfather worked at Dillard, went to Shaw, taught at Shaw, and both of them ended up for the last almost 30 years of their careers at Morgan State University, which is in Baltimore, and still
Okay.
there today. And my grandfather was a pioneer in African American history. So at a time, he did go to a PWI to Wisconsin to get his PhD and master's. And the story of kind of his experience there kind of, again, illuminates why HBCUs in the context of having a supportive faculty for your research is important. So when he was there, his advisor, so he graduated in 1940 with a PhD, but he had to make the case. He wanted to study Frederick Douglass. That was his hero.
Okay.
And he had to make the case and convince them to allow him to do so. And what he was told was that black people can't objectively study black people
Oh my.
because you're biased,
Okay.
right? And obviously, when white people have been writing history about everything for all this time, clearly that's a huge contradiction
Of course.
and a smokescreen. But he was able to convince his advisor to allow him to do so because it was in his advisor's interest, because that person was, I think his name was Heseltine, was studying Ulysses S. Grant. And so Frederick Douglass had a relationship with him. And so he allowed him to do so. But this kind of, yeah.
So just for people who are listening, we're talking. So Kweli's grandfather is Benjamin A. Quarles, and one of his well-known publications, books is Frederick Douglass in 1948, which came out of his doctoral research. So and his grandmother is Ruth Brett Quarles. I'm just saying it because you mentioned them, and I wanted to put their names out there. But this is super interesting, and it made me I'm gonna let you continue talking, but it does make me think this kind of like tone deafness, that in a way that I'm kind of reading in the white research community. It makes me, because I come from the the life sciences. I remember reading and learning about in the medical domain. There's these, I don't know, guidelines that come out, and a lot of them are just based on cohorts of white, middle-aged white men and women, and then the guidelines, and then the prescription rules or whatever are applied to all communities, including the American African community, and then, oh, it doesn't work in this community. Well, genetically there are differences. You can't apply rules of something that was studied in a white only community and then apply it to all other communities at large. And here I'm kind of getting the same, when you're talking about why HBCUs are important. I don't know if you can kind of make a link between what I just described and what you're saying, but I feel there's a link there, there can't be one size fits all and one model fits all, and we can't. I don't think. I think there's a tendency to say, oh. What's the, even in comedy, there's some sketches about I don't see color, right? But I think what I'm hearing is there's this tendency of saying this is the way science is done, and the cultural background and the history is not important. And what I'm hearing is, yes, it is important, and we wanted to study these subjects. We need to have space to study these subjects, and I find that your grandfather was lucky that he found a way because of what you just mentioned of the connections of Frederick Douglass, to end up doing his thesis on that. But he might have had just a no, and it might have been very different if his supervisor didn't find this kind of collateral advantage in it. Anyway, I don't know if I'm being very clear. But I'm gonna let you.
No, I was gonna just say one more thing, just to piggyback on what you said about just systemic racism, right? Like when you have people who are not thinking about other people, so white men, namely, historically creating frameworks that we use to analyze or to do other things, then that racism that they might not even be aware of is reified over and over and over, and then of course Black people. Are the experience is detrimental. So, for example, even now today with all this digital technology, you have facial recognition technology, right? And this largely built by white data scientists and white technologists. And then, of course, then we see that this technology has a bias and criminalizes darker skinned people regularly. Yeah. So it further reifies the racism that we see just in people, now in systems, now in technology. Because Black people weren't part of the process or the experimentation process, have participants in these studies that led to this technology. And this is true in all coding. So in other words, if you don't have people involved that can recognize these things, it's like when Pepsi put out that commercial with where the police officer gets a Pepsi and he's happy, and there's the Black Lives Matter protest, and then the Pepsi makes everything okay. Mm-hmm. There must have not been a Black person in that room saying, guys, this is going to be a problem. Like when you don't have someone there, obviously writing these things, it becomes a problem. So, I mean, I think, this systemic racism just is a cycle because it doesn't get disrupted. So back to his story, I think, but that experience, I think, also really taught him that this notion of objectivity is going to be important to being successful. So, honestly, I think objectivity, there's no such thing as absolute objectivity, right? We are all motivated to do what we do because we are subjective beings. We have a certain perspective. We have an emotional tie to whatever research we're doing, or else we wouldn't do it. There would be no motivation at all, right? So there's no such thing as true objectivity, but you can apply objective standards to your work, and that is very important, right? But you can still admit that I'm also a subjective being. And I think for him, he just knew that as a Black person pioneering in a field of study that has been said can't even really exist at that time, it was very important to put, if normally a white scholar only needs to present 4 pieces of evidence, I need to present 10, because I'm going to experience resistance, period. And that is the Black experience in America, period, that you have to be twice as good as any white person to get the same level of respect or the same type of progress. So he learned that early on, and I think applied that standard. But at the same time, he was very clear about his motivation, that he was writing this history that hadn't been written, or continuing on a tradition of, he wasn't the first to start writing this history, but he was part of this phase of Black history that was formalizing it and forcing it into the academy to be accepted. John Hope Franklin was another historian that was one of his contemporaries, who's very well known, that also was part of that process. So as these scholars did this primary research, and my grandfather did really the seminal work on the Black participation in the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, and really wrote a lot of the work that's become common knowledge in our narratives about these things and about the Black participation, he was responsible for first writing that. So it was pioneering, but he had to be very objective and very fact-based and very meticulous to start that process.
To an extreme, I imagine. Yeah,
definitely. And I mean, always working at HBCUs and teaching at HBCUs, except for where he went to get his PhD. He, in the 40s and 50s, Black history is becoming kind of more formalized and accepted. And even now, when you had the 60s and 70s, it becomes in vogue, because even PWIs now want to jump on the bandwagon, because there's the civil rights movement, there's the Black Power movement, there's students that are demanding that this be taught. So one of his books, several of his books, helped make that possible, because they were textbooks in classrooms, because there weren't textbooks to support that yet. But even throughout this process, he, remained at HBCUs. He got offers from other PWIs for prestigious positions, with more research funding. He could have, potentially had a cushier job, got more work done. But he chose to remain. They chose, both of them, my grandfather and grandmother, chose to remain at HBCUs their entire careers, because, at least for my grandfather, because it was very important to him, his primary purpose was, I need to teach Black students to make sure that they understand themselves and their history, because they will be more empowered and be more powerful people moving forward. And that is really a huge, they say the truth shall set you free. Well, I would say the truth, when applied and taken seriously, can set you on a path to power, right? It's not as simple as the truth will set you free, because a lot of people hear the truth and just one ear out the other. But, when it comes to Black folk in America, education has always been seen as a means of freedom, as a means of liberation. So there's, that tradition of education being so important to the rest of your life. And I think I've seen a similar thing at Howard University. Like, HBCUs often don't have the same resources as these other schools, right? I think I read the endowment, on average, the endowment of HBCUs is 7 times less than the PWIs. Wow. So you have endowments are huge for everyone that knows university structures. Endowments is what allows you to do so many things.
Of course.
And, I would say, I'm not going to romanticize HBCUs. Like, we have our problems. They're not perfect. They have some systemic issues often, but professors remain there because of the same kind of mission, right? I've seen awesome professors at Howard in small offices and just filled with students. And I'm just so impressed by, like, you are staying here because this is what it's about, right? Not just education for education's sake, but we're also building people up to be more empowered. And, I think the definition of power is I want to define power as it's not dominating anyone else. It's not telling anyone else what to do. It's all about yourself, right? When you talk about power, if you are thinking about anyone else, often it's like thought about as, I'm going to take over someone else or maintain control of someone else. But that's aggression, and that's really insecurity. Power is the ability to create your own destiny and have the agency over your own destiny. And then I think when it comes especially to the African-American context, that power it's not you're not truly successful if you're not associating that power with also the ability to influence your own community positively, right? We don't have the luxury of saying, like, I've made it, I got this job and I have this money. Like, that's not power, that's not success to me if you're not using that influence to help others around you and help others who have been through a similar experience. And I think that is by and large, a large part of what it means to go to an HBCU,
Uh,
or the culture there.
I find it really interesting, and I had a great interview also with Chris Emden that I think you've listened to, and he mentioned, and I don't think he went to an HBCU, but he mentioned this issue of if you are black in a PWI, eventually you'll be going through this process of like code switching and talking the right talk and walking the right walk to be accepted. And I think I have a feeling that within an HBCU, all of those layers of kind of a veneer that you need to put on to outside of that context, you don't have to do that anymore. And I think that's also power in a certain way, because you are within your right to be you, to with your culture, with the way you talk, with whatever, and that must have a very very positive impact. And I'm always thinking of mental health and of the because going through grad school is, like we said, an ordeal of sorts, and it can be taxing. And if you're, apart from just that, which all graduate students go through, you also have to code switch and appear in a certain way to feel that you're part of the group. That's taxing.
No,
I
for
don't know
sure.
if you have an idea on that.
No, definitely. I mean, I think, it's interesting. And my research has focused on racial and cultural identity of American African students and what contributes to a positive and strong identity that will help sustain you throughout the rest of your life despite racism. But I think a lot of the disparities, no, I don't think, I'm sure that a lot of the disparities in this country between Black and white people, including the so-called academic achievement gap, where over the last 4 or 5 decades, all academic indicators has always been this huge deficit between Black performance and white performance. And it's not an achievement gap, it's an opportunity gap. It's understanding the
Mm-hmm.
context of this country will help you understand it. But I think there's also many health disparities, right? We see much higher rates of diseases that are, and cancer and et cetera, always across the board between Black and white people. And it's like, at some point you have to ask why. And I think the underlying issue is racism. If there's
Mm-hmm.
always a stress, if you always, for example, feel like you have to code switch, there's always an underlying stress. And when you have an underlying stress, it becomes chronic, and you have cytokines and all these things in your body that are continuing the state of stress, and eventually it's going to lead to poor health outcomes. So when you
Mm-hmm.
have this underlying systemic and interpersonal racism to deal with, yes, you are going to have poor outcomes. And I think, definitely in the HBCU context, you don't have to code switch in the same way. I mean, I work at Howard, and I often, joke about how it's just a very comfortable atmosphere. You don't have to worry about everyone understanding your jokes, or like saying
Mm-hmm.
the wrong thing, or someone, or about the same microaggressions, racial microaggressions that you're going to hear in other settings. I don't know if you're familiar with Nipsey Hussle, but he was a rapper from the West Coast, and but he died tragically a few years ago. And it was funny because he had a family. Like, Black people were just really grieving when he was murdered, because he just represented a lot of hope and potential,
Mm-hmm.
and he was doing some really positive things. And in my office, we all live streamed the funeral, right? Some people were crying. That wouldn't have
Okay.
happened in another context, because everyone really felt this as a community loss, right? So we were all kind of grieving
Mm-hmm.
together, so I think that wouldn't have happened in another context. um, but that's the type of thing that, yeah, I think, to your point, if you don't have that same stress of like, let me always make sure I'm talking in a certain way, or being a certain way, so I'm not perceived in a certain way. That's just an
Yeah, that I'm
underlying
taken
stress.
seriously. Just being taken seriously is it can be a worry, right? It can be a
Right.
concern.
Or just being yourself, right? And I
Yeah.
think it made me think of too, after the George Floyd murder, and Black Lives Matter movement became really strong in this country during the pandemic in 2020. I noticed, well, we probably all noticed, that all these huge corporations and professional sports leagues and universities all of a sudden say Black Lives Matter on their website. They have banners on their campus. They're putting money into certain things they never would have thought of, and all of a sudden it's a big thing. Howard didn't say that on their website, because it's like, well, yeah, like, that's why we're here, right? A lot of that's just nominal, though. It became like you had to say it, or else you're not going to, look good, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that you have to say it means you haven't been doing enough, probably, all this time, to address the systemic issues.
Hmm.
And now, of course, all that's kind of out the window, and we're back to where we kind of were before,
Hmm.
with people not doing too much to change the paradigm.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're getting to the towards the end of our of our 40 something minutes, and I think there'd be so much to talk about here. But where I want to go, I have this feeling that and I'd like to maybe your input on it, because you're there, you're in the States, you know the reality, you know the terrain. But I have a feeling that a lot of people, a lot of American Africans might, who are finishing high school, might think still today in 2022, oh, university is not for me. And again, I think it's a missed opportunity of getting the whole community to a higher level of education, and to eventually, and that's what I imagine happens with HBCUs, is that with people graduating with different degrees, even with doctorates, that these people who come from different strata of society, and from different backgrounds, but from a community that's been marginalized for a long time, that they can access positions of authority, positions of I don't know, policy making, positions of innovation. And I really feel that the environment found at HBCUs, or that has been created throughout these many decades, is a very good environment, and that young people who, maybe because they look around them and they don't have anyone to model, to say, oh, my aunt went to university, I can go too. I think I don't know. I wonder whether you have a message for someone who's on the fence about, should I take my studies a little bit further before getting a job and starting that part of my life. Do you have a message for them, and like a positive message of yes, if you're curious, if you want to learn, if you really passionate about a subject, an academic subject, go on with your studies.
sure.
And do you think it's pertinent today? Because this is kind of an idea, feeling I have, but is it pertinent today to drive this messaging to people who are at that end of high school?
I think, yeah, there's a lot to discuss there, and I guess we don't have a long time, but I guess I would start with, the unfortunately, even today, I mean, the reality of how people are funding their education and getting a massive debt is really unfortunate. And,
Oh yeah, there's that, of course.
I mean, I think you have to consider, like, what are that's a whole consideration in and of itself.
That's true.
How are you going to get through it? And is it worth it to really get into debt if that's your only way? But there's other ways, but that's a whole other conversation. In terms of the opportunity or the ability or the, I guess I would take a step back and say, like, people should be lifelong learners, period. And people should seek out the truth for themselves. And people should learn how to be critically conscious, which means basically being critical of all the things around you and everything you're learning, and do your own research. We live in the information age where people just Google things and are become intellectually lazy because they just look at the first search result. My daughter tells me things and I'm like, how do you know that? Well, I Googled it. Well, Google told you. Google's not a thing. Google just brings you results from other humans. Which website did you look at? What was the name of that website? Right. So being discerning of what information you're actually like claiming and using is really important. So developing those skills from an early age is really important, even before you think about things. And I think, so my research, one thing I'll say too, is that my research, PhD and master's research, really looked at, in a nutshell, when Black students have a truthful rendering of history and looking at history, especially Africana heritage, their own ancestry from a long arc perspective. Dr. Gregory Carr from Howard University, the chairman of African American Studies Department, calls it the long arc perspective. So not just looking at what's happened since the period of enslavement, the last 400 years, how we got to this country, at least some Black people got to this country through enslavement, but then expanding that to say what happened in the last 5,000 years. Like, if you really start to examine those things, you realize these last 400 years, it's a small amount of time relative to intellectual genealogy, right? Like, knowledge itself in a very sophisticated way existed in ancient Africa prior to Europe being anything. Europeans came to Africa to learn at the universities. The
Mhm.
Moors came out of Africa into Europe to actually civilize Europe. And then ironically, they're kicked out and Columbus comes to America and starts the slave trade. Um, so if you understand history and understand that, for Black people in particular, what I saw in my research is that when Black students were given their Africana heritage, especially understanding knowledge production and the history and their connection to knowledge production throughout time and space, they are transformed. First of all, they're pissed off because they're like, why didn't the school or my family or other people teach me this?
Yeah.
But then they also get this sense of confidence, like, oh, like, this is not foreign to us. I can do this, right? And it's not like everyone needs to be a mathematician, but did you even have a chance to be a mathematician when you went to a school that there's implicit bias and implicit this what we call hegemony, cultural hegemony. Whiteness is pervading everything and basically telling us, oftentimes implicitly, like, scientific pursuits are not for you. They are for Europeans, they are for Americans. Even when you look at American inventions and innovation historically, oftentimes it was done by Black people, but they couldn't get patents. So white
Mhm.
people took credit, or enslaved people that did something, and then whoever white man could take credit, took credit. So, but when you start to understand that, right, I think it causes students to start to think critically and then ask questions about everything around them and become critically conscious. And that's what I saw when students in this program that I was examining were um, read just a little bit about their heritage when it relates to knowledge production and intellectual pursuits. They had a very different kind of relationship perspective on what they could do and what they wanted to do, or the possibilities and empowerment. And they had different conversations than with their peers. I mean, my research was done in California, in the Bay Area of California, which anyone who knows is very diverse. It's not your typical atmosphere. It's mostly actually Latinx and East Asian descendants there.
Mhm.
But there was one student who told me, like, after going through that program and realizing my history, it was just different. Like, he said he used to talk to his Mexican friends and they would tell them about their heritage and about the just all these things, and he didn't have much to add to the conversation. But then after learning about his heritage, he had a different confidence, and he said, well, I can come to the table now and I've told them about me and about all the contributions my ancestors have made to humankind. And he
Mhm.
had a different confidence and a different air about himself at that point. So that's one of the effects that you see when you start to just give the time and space to do those things. And I think, it does, doing that at an early age and creating programming in schools, because that's where the students are at, but it also has to be in the homes, it has to be everywhere we can, because we're fighting master narratives that pervade, that tell us that that's not what Black people do, or Black people are criminals and Black people don't do these things. Like, these are master narratives that pervade across all the institutions of mass socialization, including schools, most importantly. But when
Mhm.
you flip that script and you create new narratives systematically, that's how we can see a big change. But that's not being done enough, nearly enough, obviously, to make a mass change. But it can be done as much as possible. Um, and I think it obviously would contribute to people being in higher education, because once you can see yourself in these intellectual pursuits or in these academic pursuits, that's the first thing. It starts in your consciousness of, is this for me? And if you're told that no one before you and your ancestry did it, then it's just you're not going to be as it's just not going to be as engaged, right?
No.
So I think that's going to lead you to getting into um, more people getting into undergrad or graduate school. I mean, one study I saw was a 5-part study that simply putting Black content in the curriculum
Mhm.
made students more engaged, made them feel
Mhm.
more connected to their schools, and ultimately led to better outcomes in their actual performance indicators. So I think performance indicators are secondary. When you give people this information, their racial identity and cultural identity is better informed, and their beliefs. It all starts, like, I created a whole model in my dissertation, but information creates your beliefs. So if you have the right beliefs, you can go the way you want. If you have beliefs that you like, this doesn't make sense, it's going to be cognitive dissonance. You can't, it's going to work against you your whole life.
Mhm.
So it's these
Mhm.
underlying beliefs shaped by master narratives that we want to affect and change at the root. And when you give people this information, oftentimes they can take it themselves and continue, and they're going to start questioning everything, right?
It makes total sense to me. It's kind of an aha moment, and it kind of opens up this whole vista that they didn't have, because historically it's been erased from the discourse, and from, like you said, the curricula of the socialization platforms that exist. It's really, really interesting, and anyway, I can see how it applies to even other domains. But I really, really like this message of look further back into history, because history in these last like 400, 500 years has been written mostly, like you said, by a certain demographic, and it represents their interests and their agendas. And there's been a kind of there's been an erasure of a whole part of a story of your community, that if you knew, you could project yourself, say, these are my forefathers did this, this, and this, so I can do it too. Versus if your image of your history goes just back 400 years, then you can't project yourself to be, you can't model, you can't look back onto your community and model anything other than what's there in these last 400 or 500 years. It's super, super interesting. And is this something that you're following up, or was this done just in the context of your master's and PhD? Is it something you're going to follow up in terms of studies, or I don't know, interventions?
Right. No, I mean, so I'm exploring possibilities. Just finished last year, obviously, so now thinking about what's next strongly. But what I want to do is, yes, put this into practice. Again, not knowledge for knowledge sakes, but what are you going to do with that knowledge? So I want to create, or I'm in the process of working with some people to create digital learning tools for Black and brown youth, but really any youth, right? Because everyone needs to learn how to critically think. And if you're, there's this whole debate in this, or this whole movement in this country to remove even more truth from curriculum in schools. And there's a lot behind that, but the whole thing about critical race theory being taught in schools is a smokescreen. But honestly, like critical race theory is how I examine things, because if you don't understand the role of racism in this country, is basically what critical race theory is saying, that you don't really understand what's happening or what has happened. But that's not necessarily taught as a framework. This is a graduate school framework. But there's a whole movement, of course, to lessen the small amount of true historical truth that is in the curriculum. And so, a lot of schools, a lot of teachers are scared to even speak out against it, I've heard, right? So we need resources for people, for teachers and parents that need them. And I think, again, a lot of stuff, if you can do things digitally, you can reach people all across the world, and there's less of a hamper. But, digital learning tools that can help youth, Black youth in particular, number one, become critically conscious, so learn how to apply critical thinking skills to everything they're doing, but also really learn about their heritage as people of African descent, and what that means, and build this notion of success and this notion of power that they can use to help be empowered throughout the rest of their life. And when they learn about their heritage, I mean, it's a fundamental part of giving them a solid foundation. One of the, there's research around parent socialization and culture, and what they call cultural socialization. And it's very clear that when parents teach their children about their heritage as Black people, and again, even, when you start with slavery, everything looks like progress. But when you go further back, even more importantly, and start the story before that disruption, or what people call the Maafa, the Great Disruption, it's a Swahili word, then, you're filling that cup with truth and with stuff that's really nourishing their sense of what it means to be Black, and associating that with positive things. So then when they experience the racism they're inevitably going to experience, systemically and like explicitly, it doesn't have as much impact. Also it doesn't have as much impact when teachers are racist, because, a student can say, as a youth can say, hey, something's wrong with you, because I already know, that I'm good. So it's kind of roll off me a little more than those words might have. James Baldwin, said, he's an African-American author, for those who don't know, but said a long time ago that when a white man calls me the N-word, like, I know something's wrong with you, not with me. So that's the mentality people have to have, but they have to have information to undergird and give them that foundation, I think, to especially as youth, Malcolm X, this is a famous story that when he was in school, he had told his white teacher that he wanted to be a lawyer. And his teacher said, no, that's not really probably for you. You're, being black, that's not really, you probably want to get into some, I forgot what he said, but something related to like menial type of job. And had Malcolm at that time had a foundation to know like that doesn't really make sense. I can do whatever I want. I look at my ancestry. But he didn't have that. So of course that discouraged him. Ultimately, it led to Malcolm being who he was. So, his journey, it was necessary for his journey. And he was one who later really understood the extent of Africana heritage and taught about it in a great way. But, like those type of moments are pivotal for youth. And in our youth, there's a lot of research that shows the racism that's in schools that's a detriment to our youth. But if they already have what they need, it's not the same impact.
That's true,
right?
and it can come earlier than higher education for sure. Super, super interesting. Now, Kweli, we're getting really to the end. I'm going to ask you first one thing, and the thing is, if people are want to move the conversation forward, maybe with you directly, what's the best way to reach out to you? People who are
sure.
listening.
You can email me, kweli.zukeri@protonmail.com. And I would love to hear from anyone who's interested. This is a collective movement. It's something that requires a village, requires mutual aid and support. So I'm definitely open to hearing from people that are interested in moving forward that cause.
Mm-hmm. And now just to finish, we mentioned at the very beginning how a PhD, and especially if you go fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, it can become difficult. If on top of that, you're from a here is say minorité visible in French, but you're from a minority. You could be American African or another minority, and you can feel the urge to accept that, hey, to accept the imposter syndrome that also I believe all of us going through a PhD go through, and you can say, you know what, I'm not made for this. I'm going to quit, even though you're passionate about your subject, because I think that's what's sad, is to lose people who are passionate about studying particular subjects, because at a certain point there's a critique from a peer or from a superior. There's different obstacles that appear during graduate school, and people quit. What word do you have for them to I want to say bite the bullet, but maybe it's not the best term, but to hang in there and to say, no, you deserve to be there, and you deserve to become an academic, and you deserve to follow that dream and that passion?
Sure. I mean, one of the things I thought of personally was just my own family background and what I can't imagine the struggle Black folk went through in this country to get to even going to HBCUs. It's still in a very hostile environment ultimately, but even some of them going to white schools, I mean, just thinking about that type of struggle, I can't even imagine it. So for me, that was like, again, can't complain. This is a different struggle. It's still a struggle, but it was not the same. And that helped inspire me to say, I'm standing on other people's shoulders. I think too, one of the, just simply for anyone, like, it does end, right? You can get there. Like, it's on you. Unlike other degrees, you have to push it forward. No one's going to force you, but it does end. And people told me that, and of course, when you're going through it, that means nothing. So hopefully you can still hear it, but like, it does end. Like, it did end. No one's taking my degree away from me. I have it on the wall. It's in writing. It's documented. It's done. It's done. So I think, just remember, it does end. And yeah, I mean, there's all types of little frustrations and problems that emerge, right? But there's also graces that come up, right? So like, because I kept persisting for me, so I think it'll happen for anyone else. So for example, I have a good friend of mine that, is older than me, but she had got her PhD a long time ago. But when she saw that, I was towards the end, but I was struggling to just stay on myself and nobody was like keeping me accountable, she said, I'll be your accountability coach. So we met every Friday And she wasn't necessarily checking in on like, what's your research? Are you using APA style? None of that. Just like, tell me what you did this week. What progress have you made? I'm taking a I'm checking on you. What progress have you made? Right. And I think that's a great example again of like thinking about success in terms of a community. Right. She's busy. She has a family. She has a career. She didn't have time to do that. But she made sure to check in with me every Friday and talk about where I was at. And that meant so much.
Of course.
Right. And I want to make sure that if anyone else ever reaches out to me in the same way, that I can be there for them, and make sure that I'm continuing. That's a tradition to continue, So I would say, like, if you are doing the work and persisting, graces will come, and be willing to accept help, because nobody does. Like, also don't think that you have to do it on your own, because nobody in this life really does things on their own. And I'm talking to myself too, because at times I have to remember that, and not, be willing to ask for help, or be willing to accept support, from others. So
it's a great way to end this interview. I'm with you 100% on that. We go back to the idea of the PhD. There needs to be a village around you, but I think you touched on the point of finding a mentor that you can identify with. And you had I don't know how it transpired that this person offered to do this, but I would suggest, if anyone's listening, and doesn't have someone like this in their PhD or anyway graduate school village, try and look around and find someone maybe who comes from your neighborhood and who has kind of a similar journey, has had their degree for some time, someone who comes from your community, someone with whom you have something in common, and approach them. Because I know I didn't do it, and sometimes, if you're more on the introvert side, it might be a challenge to approach someone and ask for this, but the value that you can take out of it is so huge. And I just saw you were talking about it, and I think I saw in your face the kind of the emotion of, this was so good for me in such a difficult moment, and it helped me pull through. So I really, really recommend that you find someone that can play this role for you. And I know it's not easy for everyone. It doesn't come by chance to everyone, but if you there's some like alumni network that you can tap into,
right.
It's so precious help, such a precious help, that it's a great way to finish this interview. Thank you, Kweli. This was great. I really had a great time. We've stretched the interview a little bit. This was so interesting. I hope you had a good time too. And I really, again, like I had said, the model of Papa PhD is not a scripted interview, so we went different ways, but I think we covered a nice patch of terrain, and we went at different levels, more graduate school, more general, and I am really, really grateful for having had you here and having had you share all this reflection that you've been having for all these years on these subjects. And I really wish you luck and sorry, I really wish you luck and success in taking this passion forward that you have, and creating these tools that you were mentioning, because I think they will help people out there. And I do think that just changing the way how you can project yourself into the future changes what you can do today. And I'm 100% with you on that. So thank you.
Okay. Well, yeah, and thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I think I did release a little bit of trauma, so every little bit helps. I'm just thankful to be here. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that someone listening will identify with some of what you shared, and I'm sure that a lot of people listening will be inspired by some of what you shared too. So thank you for having opened up and be so frank and so generous in your sharing.
Sure.
All right.
Anytime.
So this ends the podcast recording part. Now we can chat for a minute or two. I want to thank everyone that's watching. I see 3 likes here. Let me see, Ines, Joaquin, and Salia Koulibaly. Thank you for having watched this, and be sure to share if you liked this interview, to share it. It's now going to be alive on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So on whichever platform you're watching, feel free to share with your colleagues, with your friends. And so Papa PhD is here every week, and on the podcast side also. Now this will become a podcast a few weeks from now, because I need to take the audio, edit it, clean it up, etc. But as I was saying, if the live that we just had is now on YouTube and on LinkedIn, and you can watch and share how you want. Of course, as a YouTuber, I'm always happy if you go subscribe to the Papa PhD channel. I'm almost at 200 subscribers. It's not a huge milestone, but I don't know. It'd be a nice round number. So it'll be great to have some of you subscribe. And Kweli, this was great. I'm super happy that you accepted my invitation. It departs a little bit from talking very coldly about careers and this and that, but I this year I really gave myself it's not a mission, but I really wanted to open up the conversations a little bit more into deeper things that are not so frequently talked about on these types of podcasts and platforms, and this question of HBCUs, why they're important, why they exist. I learned a lot today just hearing what you shared, and I know that a lot of the people watching and the listeners will learn too. So yeah, thanks
Great.
for that.
No, that's awesome. And I'm anytime you want to talk further and exchange, I'm here.
Sure.
Whenever we can make time, I know we
Perfect. Well, if ever because I have these ideas, I don't have a lot of time, but I really want to organize like roundtables around specific subjects, and if you're open to that, and if there's one that might interest you around this subject of inclusion and what's the term, reconciliation and things like that. I don't know, it might be something interesting in the future, but I need to make sure I have the time to organize it.
Right. No, sure. Let me know. I'm very interested.
All right. Well, to everyone watching, I'm going to close the feed. Thanks for having been here, and thanks for being fans and listeners.